Buying a home is a natural step in any couple's life. Writer Alex Rose and his wife Nancy are no exception. They are trying to find affordable housing in Brooklyn. Real estate agent Kenneth showed them a spacious duplex at a low price, but there's a catch. An elderly woman lives on the second floor, and by law, the new owners have no right to evict her. She can only leave voluntarily or well pass away. The agent introduced the couple to Mrs. Connelly, who was about to turn 100 years old. The elderly woman coughed incessantly and didn't look well at all. The duplex is conveniently located near a playground, a supermarket and everything else the couple might need. Kenneth gave the couple his business card in case they decided to buy the house. That evening, they discussed the matter with their friends. Incidentally, one of their friends, Coop, is also a writer, and his wife Celine is currently pregnant. Alex and Nancy warmly congratulated them. The next day, the couple resumed their discussion about purchasing the duplex. Alex was reluctant to share their home with an elderly woman, while Nancy was more optimistic. She believed that in the future, when they would own both floors, the duplex's value would significantly increase. In the end, Nancy managed to convince Alex, and soon the couple moved their belongings into the duplex. They decided to visit Mrs. Connelly to introduce themselves, and at first glance she seemed friendly. Alex and Nancy brought her a bottle of wine, but Mrs. Connelly declined, saying she didn't drink because it was sinful. However, she kindly offered the couple some wine instead. While Mrs. Connelly went to the kitchen, Alex accidentally damaged one of her belongings. Since the woman moved very slowly, the couple managed to pretend nothing had happened. Mrs. Connelly had a parrot named Dick, named after her late husband. She fed the bird old chips that were no longer in production, and Alex had to try them out of politeness. The taste was simply revolting. Upon learning that Alex made a living as a writer, Mrs. Connelly said that it wasn't a serious profession and noted that many writers ended their lives in poverty and drunkenness. She mentioned that her late husband, a sailor, also died of alcoholism. They had been married for 58 years but never had children, and now it was too late for her. Alex and Nancy wanted to inspect the second floor, but Mrs. Connelly refused, saying it was too late, even though it wasn't even 7 p.m. yet. When Alex got up from the couch, a certain sound was heard. An awkward silence ensued. Alex assured her it was the couch, but Mrs. Connelly continued to look at him disapprovingly. Before bed, Nancy expressed her frustration that Mrs. Connelly had refused to let them, as the legal homeowners, inspect the second floor. Furthermore, the elderly woman seemed lively and clearly wasn't planning to pass away anytime soon. A peaceful night was out of the question, as the TV on the second floor was blaring loudly. Alex politely asked Mrs. Connelly to turn it down. She complied, but a few minutes later the noise resumed. In the morning, a sleep-deprived Nancy went to work while Alex planned to finish a chapter of his book. However, he was interrupted by Mrs. Connelly, who came to return the unfinished bottle of wine. The elderly woman also asked Alex to check the pipes in her bathroom, claiming they were making strange noises. Alex heard nothing unusual. As he was about to leave, Mrs. Connelly asked him to take out her trash. Something accidentally fell, and the old woman accused Alex of rummaging through her belongings. Meanwhile, Nancy, who works at a journalism agency, was bragging to a colleague about her new spacious duplex. Her boss Herman wasn't pleased with her constant distractions. When Nancy came home from work, Alex complained that he had written almost nothing that day because their neighbor kept sending him on errands. Nancy, however, was full of enthusiasm and had bought a few decorative items for their new home on her way back. Suddenly the couple noticed that the neighbor was flooding their apartment. Mrs. Connelly claimed that there had been issues with the pipe, which she had already mentioned to Alex earlier that day. The plumber charged a lot for his work because the bathroom tiles were antique. Alex flatly refused to pay. Mrs. Connelly called him a disgrace, claiming he had done nothing all day. The next morning before heading to work, Nancy advised her husband to firmly decline if Mrs. Connelly asked him for any more favors. Barely had Alex sat down to write his book when Mrs. Connelly interrupted him again. Alex tried to politely explain that his home was like his office, where he needed to work, and that unless it was something urgent, he couldn't be distracted over trivial matters. Mrs. Connelly told Alex that she had bought a copy of his book and just wanted an autograph. This made Alex feel guilty. Naturally, he signed the book for her. However, Mrs. Connelly didn't stop there. She asked Alex to accompany her to the pharmacy to pick up her medication. Alex couldn't say no. At the pharmacy, he kept glancing at the watch. Afterward, Alex had to follow Mrs. Connelly to the supermarket, where she meticulously counted every single berry. It took up his entire day. Before bed, Alex once again complained to his wife that Mrs. Connelly was manipulating him. He couldn't understand how she did it. The TV played loudly through the night once more. Early in the morning, the couple was awakened by numerous voices. Stepping out of their room, they saw Mrs. Connelly bringing other elderly people into the house. Nancy demanded an explanation. Mrs. Connelly said these were members of their brass band. On Fridays they performed concerts at the local church. The couple couldn't have a peaceful breakfast due to the loud music, so they decided to go to the market to do some shopping. Later, they decorated a room and were about to indulge in some passion when they noticed Mrs. Connelly spying on them. Once the elderly woman left, Alex realized it was his chance to install a device in her room that could remotely turn off her TV by clapping. Unexpectedly, Mrs. Connelly returned, and Alex had to hide in a hurry. He watched as the old woman doted on her beloved parrot. Since the woman was dancing all over the second floor to music, Alex constantly had to shift his hiding spots, eventually ending up in the bathtub. As luck would have it, Mrs. Connelly decided to take a bath, unaware that Alex was hiding behind the curtain. While Nancy distracted the old woman, Alex managed to escape through the window, falling from the second floor. That night, as usual, the TV played loudly. It seemed that Mrs. Connelly had figured out the remote device in her room that turned the television off and on. The night was even more restless than the previous ones. The next day, Mrs. Connelly kept calling Nancy at the office because Alex ignored her requests. As a result, Nancy couldn't keep up with her work, which made Herman angry. In the evening, the couple hosted a party in their duplex. Gene, Alex's publisher, asked how his book was coming along. Alex assured her everything was going well, even though it wasn't true. Coop introduced Alex to his acquaintance, Chick, who acted as a consultant for his detective writing. According to Coop, Chick was a professional hitman. This left Alex stunned. Nancy decided to introduce the guests to Mrs. Connelly, describing her as a funny Irish granny. However, when the guests went upstairs, Mrs. Connelly sprayed pepper spray in their faces. Herman fell down the stairs and had to be taken away in an ambulance. The police arrived. Officer Dan told the couple that being the homeowners didn't give them the right to barge into the second floor. Moreover, Mrs. Connelly could press charges, though she pretended to be kind and declined to do so. Naturally, the party was over. After saying goodbye to the hosts, Chick left with two women. Herman fired Nancy, not because of the incident at the party, but due to an embarrassing article about Alex that had been published under her name. She had approved it carelessly, distracted by Mrs. Connelly's constant calls to the office. At home, Nancy told Alex that he needed to finish the book urgently because they needed the money. But Alex couldn't work in this environment. The worst part was that his deadline was Wednesday. Mrs. Connelly had made their lives unbearable. Even now, loud music was blaring from her room. Alex decided to try working on his book at a cafe while Nancy searched for a new job. However, she kept getting distracted by Mrs. Connelly, who called Alex a jobless loafer. Later, the old woman took Nancy to the kitchen, claiming there were mice. That evening, Nancy complained to the husband that Mrs. Connelly hadn't given her a moment's peace all day. The next day the same story repeated itself, and to make matters worse, Mrs. Connelly's parrot attacked Nancy, frightening her badly. The elderly woman blamed Nancy for the incident. The couple tried to spend as much time as possible outside the house, brainstorming ways to convince Mrs. Connelly to move out. They gave her a box of expensive chocolates and explained that they wanted to have a child and live here as a family. They even offered to pay Mrs. Connelly if she would move somewhere else, like Ireland. Mrs. Connelly said it was a good idea since she hadn't been back to her homeland in 50 years. But then, she suddenly choked on a piece of chocolate. In a panic, Alex and Nancy began performing first aid. When Mrs. Connelly regained consciousness, the whole situation looked highly ambiguous. Mrs. Connelly immediately contacted the police, accusing Alex of inappropriate behavior. Alex tried to explain what had really happened, but he was still added to a special registry. The couple regretted saving Mrs. Connelly's life. Alex had only 12 hours left to finish his book, and he was forced to work in a noisy cafe. Nancy was getting ready for a job interview but was once again interrupted by Mrs. Connelly, who asked her to hammer a nail into the stairs. Meanwhile, the old woman kept commenting on how poorly Nancy was doing it. Barely holding herself back, Nancy imagined pushing the neighbor down the stairs. Nancy couldn't help but share this with her husband. Alex admitted that he too often fantasized about harming Mrs. Connelly. She had ruined their lives. At least Alex had managed to finish his book. The couple planned to celebrate, but back at home, Mrs. Connelly claimed a giant rat had run under her buffet and asked Alex to catch it. It turned out to be just a small field mouse, but Mrs. Connelly grabbed Alex's bag and threw it at the animal, hitting the fireplace. Alex's laptop, containing the only copy of his book, melted in the process. While trying to extinguish the laptop, Alex accidentally dropped it onto the road. A passing truck ran over it, completely destroying the book. Alex was convinced Mrs. Connelly had done it on purpose. That night, as usual, Mrs. Connelly's TV played loudly. The next morning, the old woman asked Alex to sprinkle salt on the slippery porch steps. In response, Alex advised her not to leave the house and promptly slipped on the stairs himself. Naturally, Alex's publisher didn't believe his crazy story about the truck and the laptop. The publishing house terminated his contract. On the subway ride home, Alex fantasized about something bad happening to Mrs. Connelly. There was a flu epidemic going around, and Alex did everything he could to catch it so he could then infect Mrs. Connelly. Both he and Nancy fell ill and decided to visit Mrs. Connelly, bringing her popcorn that they had sneezed on beforehand. The old woman complained that her kitchen sink was clogged. Alex, who already felt unwell, had to unclog the drain. It was awful. Casually, Mrs. Connelly mentioned that she had gotten a flu shot. The couple decided to urgently sell the duplex, but the realtor said they would need to drop the price significantly. Otherwise, no one would want to live with Mrs. Connelly. Yes, Kenneth had lied when he assured them she was nice. Alex and Nancy realized they were trapped. Now both unemployed, they were stuck in the house with Mrs. Connelly. They couldn't take it anymore. The couple resolved to get rid of her at all costs. In the evening, when Mrs. Connelly went out for a walk with her parrot, they sneaked upstairs and set up traps for her, hoping she would have an accident. But the couple ended up becoming victims of their own plan. That night, water dripped from the ceiling onto them. Alex went upstairs under the pretense of fixing the plumbing. In reality, he made the leak worse. The couple hoped that Mrs. Connelly, who changed TV channels at least 19 times a night, would fall through the floor. Soon the ceiling did collapse. Alex and Nancy narrowly avoided injury, but Mrs. Connelly was unharmed. At least her TV was broken. The police and a rescue team arrived. Mrs. Connelly told them that Alex had been repairing the pipes. Officer Dan informed Alex that he would have to pay a fine and buy Mrs. Connelly a new television. All this pushed Alex to acquire an illegal gun. The couple had tried everything else, and this seemed like the only solution. However, Nancy accidentally fired a shot, injuring Alex. That's how he ended up in the hospital. Officer Dan was going to charge them. Luckily, Alex's wound turned out to be minor. Nancy decided they had taken the wrong approach. One night, the couple sneaked onto the second floor with a pillow through the elevator shaft, but Mrs. Connelly wasn't asleep. Alex and Nancy had no idea she smoked. It was obvious Mrs. Connelly wouldn't let them live in peace. And despite her age, the old woman clearly had no intention of dying. Alex and Nancy had to leave with nothing. Those were the strangest 7 minutes of their lives. Mrs. Connelly's new television was even louder. The whole situation felt like a waking nightmare. Suddenly Alex remembered Chick, the hitman. They explained the task to him and asked how much it would cost. Chick demanded $25,000, which was his minimum price. The couple had no choice but to agree. Chick promised to carry out the job on Christmas Eve and instructed them to leave the money in the elevator shaft. Now they just had to figure out where to get that kind of money. Alex asked Coop for a loan, but he refused. Alex hated Coop for how everything in his life seemed to go perfectly. The couple had to sell nearly all the furniture in their home. Christmas arrived, and Chick was ready to carry out the job. Alex and Nancy didn't expect Officer Dan to show up, bringing Christmas cookies for Mrs. Connelly. The couple tried to keep him out of the house, but it didn't work. To distract the officer, Nancy began hitting her husband. Dan stated he would return in 10 minutes, and they'd have big problems. Chick was preparing to attack Mrs. Connelly when she suddenly shot him with a harpoon. During their struggle, the fire from the fireplace began to spread through the room. Chick fled in terror. Of course, Alex and Nancy had no intention of saving Mrs. Connelly, but unfortunately for them, the firefighters arrived promptly. To avoid suspicion, Alex had to help rescue Mrs. Connelly. The official cause of the fire was declared to be faulty wiring. Soon the realtor found new buyers for the duplex. Alex and Nancy even decided to say goodbye to Mrs. Connelly, only to discover she had peacefully passed away in her armchair. The couple couldn't believe it at first. Thus ended this crazy story of confrontation. Or did it? In truth, Mrs. Connelly had faked her death, and she turned out to be Kenneth and Dan's mother. Together they had been running this scam for years, profiting from the sale of the house. By the way, Alex wrote a book about Mrs. Connelly, and it became a bestseller. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.